Good morning. So today's talk is on persistence. I guess I could call it Nevertheless, You Persisted. And of course, what's on my mind today is Ruth Bader Ginsberg and her death last night. And it's so terribly sad for so many reasons. So I was thinking a lot about, what I was going to say, and I'll show you my notes for today's talk. It's a blank piece of paper, basically. But what I came up with were the stories that I just feel like the stories are just coming out of my pores, and her story is one of the stories. So let's start with her story and let's move from there. So I called it up earlier, so let me find it. So her story. This is the version by the ACLU she worked for. So she was born in Brooklyn in 1933 to Jewish parents with roots in Eastern Europe. Her mom, Celia, died just before she graduated from high school, and her mother gave her the gift of a sense of independence and a love of learning. She went to public high school in New York. She was from Brooklyn. And she went on to Cornell University. She was 17, where she met her future husband, Martin Ginsberg. And she said what she most appreciated about him, Marty, she called him, was that he didn't feel threatened by her intellect. And as many of you know her story, he celebrated her. He was behind the push for her to eventually become a Supreme Court justice. He helped her. He did the cooking at home. So he was very supportive and helpful. So what else? She went to Harvard Law School. She was a young mother. She was one of 9 women. And her being there was questioned by men and by teachers, even the dean. And I think she shared a story of the dean making these young women. And if you see the photo, she's way over at the side, and she's very small compared to the others. So he made these women, he asked us each to stand up and tell him what they were doing at Harvard, taking a seat that could be occupied by a man. So this is the sort of a theme that comes up a lot in these stories that I feel filled with today. What are you doing here? You don't belong. Why are you taking a seat that could be occupied by a man? So this is a trend that continued. When her husband took a job in New York City, she transferred to Columbia Law School. She graduated first in her class and then had trouble getting a job because no one would hire a woman. She later took a teaching job at Rutgers, where she was paid less than her male colleagues. And then later she took a teaching job at Columbia, where she was the first tenured law professor who was a woman. So, in the face of this, a lot of us would shut down. That's already a lot. I mean, she started off, I don't know what her family's home life was like, but we know the era. And she started off in public school and got into Harvard, went to Harvard despite being told she wasn't wanted there, and did quite well. And that trend continued. She didn't let other people's opinion of her stop her. And this is what, for me, this is what I really admire. And then she also, took this injustice against her and made it for the benefit of others. She took something that's not right in the world and dedicated her life to serving for the benefit of others. So when she received discrimination at Rutgers, she and her other female professors, they filed a class action discrimination case against the university, and they won. So then she helped all the people who came after her by being willing to do that, being able to do that. And it continued from there. She volunteered for the ACLU. She soon got into cases that had to do with gender discrimination, but she was very savvy in the way that she brought these cases and built a web of support around the idea of equal treatment for women by incorporating men. And she continued. Her husband had cancer when their children were small. She continued. And she took care of him as well. And she kept going. She, as you know, she eventually, I can skip ahead a lot of this because she's done so much. So she kept going, and she eventually won a seat on the Supreme Court of the United States. Just phenomenal. And even there, she kept going. It said that she would work into the early hours of the morning, even in her 80s, she's 87 when she died. She stayed very sharp, very supportive, and just kept very doggedly continuing, never letting up. I had the chance to see her speak when I first moved to New York, not too long afterwards, and I was sort of snuck into this room. I say snuck because I think I was one of the only women who was not an attorney in that room, and into a room of women lawyers at the New York City Bar Association. And she was giving a talk with Gloria Steinem. And I just felt moved to tears to be there and in her presence, both of their presence, but in particular her presence. Because she's worked so hard for me, whom she has never met. So this is really what inspires me the most. And I feel terribly sad today that she's gone. And also quite moved and impressed at the timing of her death. It's so amazing. This is the most, for Jewish people, this is the most auspicious time, as Tibetan Buddhists would say, the most auspicious time to die. This is the time when great leaders die. And here she is going out as a great leader. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah. so touched and so sad. And so today I just trying to think of what I can say to honor her. And I can say not very much, but I can honor her through my own presence here in female body. And I think that's something that I think we don't realize what a big deal that is. So I'd like to talk about that as well. This spring, I went to Los Angeles for a meeting, and it was a very painful meeting. So I've been involved in a ceremony that's going to honor the 100th anniversary of Soto Zen in North America, or at least continental North America. And when I was asked, when the call went out for volunteers for the ceremony, I want to do it. Raise my hand. I was so excited. And, it's this big old, huge Japanese style ceremony. So not so interesting to some Westerners, but it's so beautiful and so moving. And I had done this ceremony at the women's monastery in Japan, and just found it so moving. And so I wanted to do this. So I volunteered, and I trained and went to France in 2018. 2020. No, it was last year. It was 2019. I went to France to learn the ceremony. And to make a long story short, I was met with extreme sexism. And this isn't a new thing for me. I've been met with extreme sexism throughout all of my training as a Buddhist nun, because the Japanese system is extremely sexist. And women are not permitted to train in the monasteries with men, which might have some understandable reason, except that there aren't monasteries for women. There's just one. And I went to the women's monastery for a length of time. And then there's one more place where men and women could train together. And this is my lineage monastery. So I really wanted to train there. And there was a difference in the way that men and women were trained in Japan. And in the women's monastery, we learned a lot of things like how to make tea, how to arrange flowers, how to serve guests. It was in many ways a wonderful place. It was very tiny. And I lived in one room with 6 nuns. We each had one tatami, which is a small mat to sleep on, to be on. And I wanted to practice in my lineage temple, and I wanted to sit zazen and do sesshin. And so I begged my teacher to let me go to this mixed monastery, and he did. And I practiced. I was really quite happy there, and it was extremely sexist. And I'll tell you a couple of things. I won't go into all of the many ways, but women have to do everything last in the monastery. We go to the zendo last. We eat our food last. We get served last. When we enter the Buddha hall, no matter what, usually ranking and would be according to your ordination date, but it was always the men ordained, the lay men, the ordained women, and the lay women. So we always went last for everything. And I knew that before going. And I was there for training and I was a novice. So it was something that I didn't like, but I accepted. But one day it really hit me when we didn't have many lay people there, but some people came in from Germany, a group, and it was time for the bath. And it was the monastery, you're very busy. So it was very busy. I had jobs to do. And I noticed that the monks went for their bath. It's a Japanese style bath. So it's a very large bath that everybody uses, in turn. The monks went, and then I had my little bath kit and I was ready to go. And then I noticed that the lay men went ahead of the nuns, which I was very surprised by. And I thought that was a mistake. So I went to the head monk in my part of the monastery and I was like, excuse me, but, something happened and the laymen went for their bath ahead of the nuns. And he said, "Mochiron," which means, of course they did. And that little word just got to me so much. Why, of course? There's a lot of course. So what is of course about? In the face of injustice, who decides of course? There's a passage in Dogens Zenji, and I asked this monk about it. I said, "You know what, Guy?" He was a really sweet guy, actually. But you know what, Guy? What about Daihai Tokusu? And he said, "Oh, Tenku, that Dogen fascicle, somebody made that up and they stuck it in the Shobogenzo later." And I was like, really? Because I never heard that. So Daihai Tokusu is part of the teachings of Dogen Zenji, the founder of Soto Zen. And I want to share a little bit with you. First, this part. When you meet teachers, he's quoting Shakyamuni Buddha. When you meet teachers who expound the supreme state of Bodhi, have no regard for their race or caste. Do not notice their looks, do not dislike their faults, do not examine their deeds. Only because you revere their wisdom, let them eat, etc. Take care of them, he's saying. And then he goes on a little bit further to say, this is very Dogen. There's the ancient example of the god Indra prostrating himself to a wild dog as his master and asking it for the Dharma. Nevertheless, stupid people who do not listen to the Buddha's Dharma say, "I am a senior bhikkhu. I cannot prostrate myself to a junior. I cannot prostrate myself to a woman. None. I am head of the monks, and I cannot prostrate myself to lay people," etc. He says, Dogen goes on to say, stupid people like these have heedlessly fled their father's kingdom and are wandering on the roads of foreign lands. Therefore, they neither see nor hear the Buddha's truth. When a bhikshuni, that's a nun, when a nun who has got the truth and got the Dharma manifests herself in the world, monks who seek the Dharma and learn and practice will devote themselves to her order, prostrating themselves and asking about the Dharma. This is an excellent example of learning and practice. It is like the thirsty finding drink. I'm going to skip a little. As regards to attainment of the truth, both men and women attain the truth. And we should just profoundly revere every single person who has attained the Dharma. And he includes a lot of examples of how this happened. So when this monk told me, of course, and told me that this was a made-up fascicle, I did not believe him. I resolved to answer the great mystery myself from my own understanding, not reliant on someone else's opinion of me. And I continue this resolve today. And this is what I really admire about Ruth Bader Ginsberg. In the face of people telling her who she was, she found who she was out of her own inside out. And this is what I want to encourage all of you to do as well. Don't let anyone else decide your truth for you. We have the teachings. We have the path. We don't have to let someone else's opinion of us, someone else's negative opinion of us, hold us back. And yet, it's harder. I don't want to lie about that. And I want to say a few words about that as well. So I started off saying I went out to LA for a meeting. So I felt very strongly that if we're going to do this ceremony in the United States, it's not acceptable for nuns to be treated lower than monks. And you know what? It was really, really hard. It took me about a year of work to convince people. And I didn't just have to convince the Japanese. I had to work with my Western counterparts who are men. And they were some of them were very resistant. And their resistance didn't look the same as that, of course. Their resistance was, Tenku, I promise you, I will do everything I can to support women, they would say. And then when things started happening, they didn't notice. And so then I was like, hey, monk, remember that conversation we had where you made a promise to me that you would do everything to support women? You're not doing that right now. What are you talking about? This is what he said. This is what he did in his actions. When things really heated up, he reverted right back into habit of being on top. And it's not that he intentionally stepped on me, although he did order me to do things a few times, and I did refuse. I said, would you like to ask me to help you with that rather than telling me? And he went, sure, would you mind? And I was like, I would be happy to help you. Mostly he just didn't notice. And also the Western women didn't notice. And you know why they didn't notice? Because they had never experienced that themselves. So my experience didn't register for them because it wasn't their experience practicing here in the West. In other words, because they didn't practice in Japan, they didn't understand what I was talking about. So that's fine if you don't understand someone else's experience, but something that I would like to suggest that you do, if you don't, is A, start off with an open mind. Maybe you could believe them. B, You could ask them about it. And you could have an openness to their story. So these are not things that I met with. In fact, the women, some said in their mouths that they supported me, but when things really happened, they did not. So there I was kind of all by myself. At least I felt that way. And I had one woman who was with me. And I wanted to quit so many times. Why do I need to do this? You know, I have my own temple now. I'm not a novice anymore. I have a place to practice. I'm safe. And what made me do this is envisioning all of the young women in the future whom, if I didn't find the reserves and the strength to do this, would have to go through the same things. And this is what Ruth Bader Ginsberg did for us. So I found the strength, and I made my case, and I took a lot of negotiations, and finally the bishop, at the end of it all, he said, and he still didn't quite understand what I was asking. When he finally understood, he said, wow. So what you're asking is that men and women be treated equally in the Buddha hall, in the ceremony. And people were like, yeah. And he went, that would be revolutionary. And then, to my utter surprise, he went, okay. He said yes. So, yeah. So that's where the story should end, right? Hurrah, everything's great. But I'm going to tell you this too. That evening, I don't know, like maybe I should have felt celebratory, but I didn't. I felt bereft. I felt sad. I cried. I was exhausted. I went to sleep early. I woke up tired. I took the plane back to New York the next day. I got COVID. So it does something to us to have to fight that hard. So the fact that she sustained that through a lifetime is really impressive to me. And you know, we don't have a choice. And I'm saying this not only about women now, I'm saying this about all of us. Once we take on the Bodhisattva vow, once we decide this is what we're going to do, it can be heavy sometimes. It can be heavy, and we can want to close our eyes, go into our own zazen, and not notice. Because if we lift up our eyes and look around, we can see suffering everywhere. We can see suffering in the form of injustice all around us. Not only as women, in so many different ways. We've been talking about this so much lately. The suffering of racial injustice, the suffering of poverty, the suffering of putting children into cages and separating them from their parents, the suffering of some people having so much and some people having so little. It can be heavy. And we're really noticing this right now. This is a heavy thing to see. And what I want to encourage you to do is to persist. Take an out breath. Take an in breath. Try again. Let go. And resume. If we continually push, then we're going to get too tired. We have to also pull back. And like this, we can support each other to do this work, which is so important and so meaningful and so challenging. So, nevertheless, let's persist with diligence, with the tools that we develop, and with heart, not for ourselves, but for the benefit of all. Be